There are things in life you can't explain to anyone, not because they're shameful, but because words never quite carry the full weight of what you felt. For a long time, I thought my story was one of those things. I kept it folded neatly inside me, the way my mother used to fold linen, edges tucked in, corners aligned, nothing sticking out. But folded things gather dust too, and eventually you realize that keeping a truth hidden doesn't preserve it. It just makes it harder to recognize when you finally take it out again. So, I want to tell this honestly from the beginning without dressing it up in drama it doesn't need. My name isn't important. What matters is that I was a child once who didn't know why he felt out of place in his own reflection, and I grew into someone who slowly, painfully, and gratefully learned why. Welcome! We're so happy you're here. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe and become part of our growing family. Thank you for joining our community. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew the shape of everyone else's life. The bakery opened at 6, the school bell rang at 8, and the men gathered outside the hardware store to talk about weather and wages, while the women moved through kitchens that smelled of onions and bay leaves. My father worked long hours at a factory an hour away, and my mother took care of the house and my younger sister and, in her quiet, steady way, of me. We weren't poor, but we were careful. Every coin had a job. Every meal had a plan. Every child had a role. Mine was to be the responsible older boy, the one who watched over his sister and carried the groceries and stood straight at family gatherings so the aunts could squeeze my cheeks and say I was going to be a fine young man someday. I never argued with that title. I just didn't recognize myself inside it. From the earliest years I can remember, there was a soft, persistent feeling that something in the mirror didn't match something inside me. I couldn't have named it then. I didn't have words for identity or gender or expression. I only had impressions, small, quiet impressions, the kind children collect without knowing they're collecting anything. I noticed how my cousin's dresses moved when she spun in the yard, and I noticed how my own clothes felt heavier, stiffer, less alive. I noticed how women in my family laughed together in the kitchen, arms brushing, hair falling into each other's shoulders, and how the men stood apart in the yard, hands in pockets, voices lower, gestures smaller. I wanted the kitchen. I wanted the laughter. I wanted the softness. But I also knew, in the way children know things they've never been told, that wanting was not the same as being allowed. The first time I saw my cousin's dress up close, I was maybe 7 or 8. She had come to stay with us for a summer because her parents were going through what the adults called a difficult time. She was 2 years older than me, and she brought a suitcase that seemed impossibly full for such a small girl. She unpacked it in the guest room, and I sat on the edge of the bed watching her hang each item on a wooden rod my mother had cleared for her. There was one dress in particular, pale blue with tiny white flowers, that she hung last, smoothing the fabric with both hands as if it were something sacred. She told me her grandmother had made it for her, and she wore it only on special days. I don't remember what I said. I remember what I felt. I felt a quiet, strange ache, like being homesick for a place I had never been. That summer passed the way summers do when you're a child, slow and endless, and then suddenly gone. My cousin left in August, and she left behind a few things she said she'd grown out of. My mother put them in a bag to give away, but she didn't get around to it right away. The bag sat in the hallway closet for weeks. I knew it was there. I knew what was in it. And one afternoon, when the house was empty and the light through the curtains was that particular yellow that makes rooms feel like they're holding their breath, I opened the closet and I opened the bag and I lifted out the pale blue dress with the tiny white flowers. I didn't put it on. I just held it against my chest and looked in the hallway mirror, and I saw something in my own eyes that I had never seen before. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't rebellion. It was recognition. Like meeting someone you had somehow always known. I put the dress back. I folded the bag exactly the way my mother had folded it. I closed the closet door. And I didn't tell anyone. For weeks afterward, I felt guilty about it, not because I had done something wrong in any moral sense, but because I had touched a truth I wasn't supposed to touch, and I was afraid that the truth had touched me back. I was afraid that whatever I had seen in the mirror was going to follow me around now, tapping me on the shoulder at inconvenient moments, whispering questions I couldn't answer. And that, more or less, is what happened. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But the whispering started, and it never fully stopped. I would be sitting in class, listening to my teacher explain long division, and a stray thought would drift through my head about the way a certain sweater might feel, or the way a certain hairstyle might look, and I would push it away and stare harder at the numbers on the board. I would be walking home from school with my friends, kicking a stone along the sidewalk, and I would catch a glimpse of a woman on the other side of the street and feel not attraction but something closer to longing, a wish to move through the world the way she moved through it. I didn't understand these feelings, and I had no framework to place them in, so I did what many children do with confusing feelings. I filed them under the word wrong, and tried to forget which drawer I had used. By the time I was 10, I had developed a very particular kind of double life, though at that age I would not have called it that. On the outside, I was a quiet, well-behaved boy who did his homework, helped his mother with the dishes, and played soccer badly but earnestly with the other boys in the neighborhood. On the inside, I was a small and constant archive of noticed things. I noticed which of my mother's dresses hung in the back of her closet and which she wore often. I noticed which of my aunts had the longest hair and which of my cousins had started wearing lipstick. I noticed the way department store mannequins tilted their hips and the way magazine models held their hands. I wasn't collecting these observations to imitate anyone. I was collecting them because they felt like clues to a puzzle I didn't yet know I was solving. The first time I actually put on a piece of women's clothing, I was 11. It wasn't the pale blue dress. That dress had long since been given away, and I had grieved it privately, the way children grieve small losses that adults don't recognize as losses. It was a soft gray cardigan of my mother's that had ended up in a laundry basket instead of her closet. I was folding clothes for her, a chore I had asked to do, and when I lifted the cardigan out of the basket, I felt that same yellow light stillness settle over the room. I looked around, though I already knew I was alone. I slipped my arms into the sleeves. I pulled it closed across my chest, and I stood in front of the small mirror on the wall of the laundry room, and I looked at myself, and I cried. I didn't sob. I didn't shake. I just felt tears slide down my face in steady, quiet way, the way rain slides down a window when the storm is soft. I don't know exactly what I was crying about. I think I was crying because for the first time in my short life, I had seen something in the mirror that didn't feel like a costume. Everything else had felt like a costume. This felt like skin. I took the cardigan off, folded it carefully, and placed it on top of the pile. I went back to my chores. I said nothing at dinner. But something inside me had shifted, and I knew, in a way that a child knows things without fully knowing them, that I was going to have to figure out who I was, and that figuring it out was going to be a long and lonely road. The years between 11 and 15 were, in retrospect, the loneliest of my life, though at the time I didn't know they were lonely because loneliness was the water I swam in, and I had never known any other water. I threw myself into the roles expected of me. I got good grades. I stayed out of trouble. I made a small circle of friends, all boys, and I learned to talk about the things they talked about, the games and the teams and the girls they claimed to like. I laughed when they laughed. I rolled my eyes when they rolled their eyes. I performed masculinity the way a diligent student performs a memorized speech, technically accurate, but internally hollow. And every night, in the small bedroom that felt smaller each year, I lay awake and wondered what was wrong with me. I want to be careful here because I know how easy it is to slip into the language of pathology, to describe those years as if I were broken. I wasn't broken. I was just uninformed. I had no vocabulary for what I was feeling. I had never met anyone who had lived through anything similar. The internet in my town was slow and shared, and the search terms I might have used were the same search terms I was terrified of anyone finding in the browser history. So I did what many young people in my position have done. I improvised a private language for myself. I called the feelings the other side. I called the longing the quiet. I called the fear the fog. And I spoke to myself, silently, in this language for years. There were nights when the quiet would rise up so strongly that I would sneak out of bed and stand in front of the bathroom mirror and try to see, in my own reflection, the person I suspected I might be underneath. I would tuck my hair behind my ears. I would soften my expression. I would tilt my head the way I had seen women tilt their heads. And sometimes, just for a moment, I would catch a glimpse of her, whoever she was, looking back at me. And then the light would shift or a floorboard would creak elsewhere in the house and I would flinch and the glimpse would vanish and I would go back to bed feeling both comforted and haunted. I never once, in those years, did anything I considered harmful. I want to say that clearly because I think there is a temptation in stories like this to build tension by suggesting that the narrator was sneaking around doing something wicked. I wasn't. I didn't take things that weren't mine to keep. I didn't lie to hurt anyone. I didn't expose anyone to anything they hadn't consented to see. My exploration, such as it was, happened almost entirely inside my own head, and on the rare occasions it involved a physical object, it involved only things that were freely available in my own home, and that I returned to their exact place afterward. I mention this not to congratulate myself, but because I think it matters. Identity exploration does not have to involve harm. It should not involve harm. And one of the most important lessons I learned, though it took me many more years to fully understand it, is that the way we handle our own uncertainty says as much about our character as the certainties we eventually arrive at. When I was 15, my grandmother died. She was my father's mother, and she had lived alone in a small apartment 3 towns over, in a building where the hallway always smelled like boiled cabbage and floor polish. I had loved her in a distant, respectful way. She was not a warm woman, but she was fair, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel seen without feeling exposed. Her death was not sudden. She had been ill for months. But when it came on a Tuesday afternoon, and my father drove home from work early, and my mother sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank. That weekend, we went to her apartment to help sort her things. My father did the heavy work. My mother did the paperwork. My sister and I were given the smallest task, which was to go through my grandmother's closet and separate what could be donated from what should be kept. I remember standing in that closet with my sister, surrounded by the dresses and blouses and scarves of a life that was now over, and feeling a strange, quiet honor. My sister took the task lightly, holding up items and making little jokes about our grandmother's taste. I couldn't join her. I was too aware of the weight of what we were touching. And then, near the back of the closet, behind a coat that hadn't been worn in years, I found a small cardboard box, and inside the box was a photograph I had never seen before. It was of my grandmother as a young woman, maybe 20 years old, standing in a field with her arm around another young woman I didn't recognize. Both of them were laughing. Both of them were wearing simple summer dresses. And on the back of the photograph, in my grandmother's careful handwriting, were the words, "The summer I was myself." I stared at that photograph for a long time. My sister asked what I had found, and I told her nothing important, and I slipped the photograph into my pocket. I don't know who the other woman was. I don't know what my grandmother meant by that sentence. I never asked my father, because I sensed it was not my story to unfold. But that photograph became a kind of talisman for me. I kept it in a book on my shelf, and sometimes, when the fog was heavy and the quiet was loud, I would take it out and look at my grandmother's face and remind myself that people have been finding ways to be themselves for as long as there have been selves to find. Whatever my grandmother had meant, she had meant something, and she had trusted the future enough to leave the evidence behind. High school was a slow, wearing kind of endurance. I did well academically, because school was one of the few places where I could disappear into a task and forget about the fog. I made a few closer friends, one in particular, a boy named T, who had a quiet, thoughtful way about him that I found restful. We would sit together during lunch and talk about books and music and small philosophical questions that felt enormous to us then. I never told T about the quiet. I never told anyone. But being around T taught me something important, which is that intimacy does not require full disclosure. You can love someone deeply and still keep certain rooms of yourself locked, not out of dishonesty, but because you haven't finished furnishing them yet. Later, when I had furnished those rooms, I would open them to a few carefully chosen people. But in high school, I was still building the walls. I dated a girl briefly in my last year of high school. Her name was Elle, and she was kind and smart and had a laugh that sounded like a small bell. I liked her, genuinely. I still like her, in the way you like people from your past whose lives moved on parallel tracks to yours. But I could not love her the way she deserved to be loved, because I could not offer her the whole of me when I did not yet know what the whole of me was. We broke up amicably, or as amicably as anything is at 18. She told me, on the last evening we walked together, that she had always felt there was a part of me I wasn't showing her. I didn't argue. I just said I was sorry. She said, "Don't be sorry. Just find it, whatever it is." I have thought about that sentence many times since. It was one of the most generous things anyone has ever said to me. I moved to a city for university, and the city was the first place in my life where I felt like the fog had a chance of lifting. Not because cities are magic, but because cities are large enough to contain multitudes, and in a large enough crowd, you can begin to hear your own thoughts. I studied a subject that had nothing to do with identity or gender or psychology. I studied it because it was practical and because my parents approved of it and because I still, at that point, was operating under the assumption that my life would be built on the outside first and only later, if ever, on the inside. But the city gave me something my hometown never could, which was anonymity, and anonymity gave me the courage to begin, very slowly, to explore. The first thing I did was read. I read everything I could find. I read memoirs and academic articles and clumsy blog posts and beautiful essays. I read about people who had felt what I felt, and I read about people who had felt something different but adjacent, and I read about people who had chosen many different paths through their own uncertainty. I did not immediately identify with any single label. I approached the reading the way you might approach a large library when you don't yet know what you're looking for. You pull books off shelves. You skim. You put some back. You take some home. And gradually, over months and years, you begin to notice which shelves you keep returning to. I want to be honest about something here because I think honesty is the only thing that makes stories like this worth telling. During those years, I made mistakes. I did not make dramatic mistakes. I did not hurt anyone in ways that require a public reckoning. But I made the ordinary mistakes of a young person trying to figure themselves out while also trying to maintain the appearance of already being figured out. I was sometimes evasive with people who deserved directness. I was sometimes withdrawn with people who deserved presence. I sometimes let friendships fade because I did not have the energy to maintain them while also carrying the private weight of my own questions. I regret those mistakes, not because they were catastrophic, but because I understand now that the people around me were carrying their own weights too, and I could have been more generous with them if I had been more generous with myself. The turning point, if there was one single turning point, came in my third year of university. I was living in a small apartment with a roommate who worked nights and slept days, which meant that for large portions of the week, I had the apartment to myself. One evening, I came home from class and found that I had a few uninterrupted hours ahead of me. I sat on the edge of my bed. I looked at the closet I had been carefully filling with a small collection of items I had bought over the past year, each one purchased with a mixture of nervousness and quiet joy. A skirt, a blouse, a pair of simple flats. Nothing dramatic, nothing costume-like, just clothes. Clothes that fit the person I suspected I might be. And I decided, that evening, that I was going to stop treating this exploration as a shameful secret and start treating it as a serious inquiry. I put on the clothes. I stood in front of the mirror. And this time, unlike the laundry room mirror when I was 11, I didn't cry. I just looked. I looked for a long time. I noticed what I liked about what I saw, and I noticed what still felt uncertain. I noticed that the person in the mirror was not a stranger, and was not a costume, and was not a fantasy. She was a version of me. Not the only version. Not necessarily the final version. But a real one. And I made a promise to that version of myself, standing there in the small mirror of a small apartment in a large city, that I would not abandon her again. I might not be able to introduce her to the world right away. I might not even know, yet, what her introduction should look like. But I would stop pretending she didn't exist. I would stop folding her into the back of the closet like an old bag of hand-me-downs. The years that followed were not a straight line. I want to say that clearly because I think one of the most damaging things about the way stories like this are sometimes told is that they suggest a clean arc from confusion to clarity to triumph. My arc was not clean. My arc had detours and backtracks and long, flat stretches where nothing seemed to move. There were months when I wore the clothes I had bought only twice, and months when I wore them almost every evening. There were weeks when I felt certain about who I was and weeks when the certainty dissolved into the old fog. There were conversations I rehearsed 100 times in my head and never had, and conversations I had without rehearsal that changed the direction of my life. What I learned, slowly, was that identity is not a puzzle you solve once and put away. It is a relationship you have with yourself, ongoing, evolving, deserving of the same patience you would offer any other important relationship. The first person I told was T, the friend from high school. We had stayed in loose touch through university, exchanging occasional letters and, later, occasional messages. He came to visit me one weekend during my 4th year. We went for a long walk along a river that ran through the city. It was autumn, and the trees were doing their slow, spectacular business of letting go. I had been thinking for weeks about whether to tell him, and if so, how. I had rehearsed a dozen openings. In the end, I used none of them. I just said, walking beside him along the water, "There's something about me I haven't told anyone, and I would like to tell you, if that's all right." He said, "Of course." And I told him, not everything. I didn't have the language for everything yet, but I told him about the fog and the quiet and the person in the mirror. I told him I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I knew it was real, and I knew it wasn't going away, and I wanted at least one person in my life who knew. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I was done, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to worry. And then he said, "Thank you for telling me. I don't fully understand yet, but I'll learn. And whatever you figure out, I'm still your friend." I have thought about those sentences many times. They are, I now believe, the essential architecture of any good response to a disclosure like the one I made that day. Thank you. I don't fully understand yet. I'll learn. I'm still here. If more people knew how to respond that way, the world would be gentler than it is. Telling T changed something in me. Not because his approval was necessary, but because the act of saying the words out loud to another human being made the truth feel less like a private hallucination and more like a shared reality. Language, I have come to believe, is one of the tools by which we make ourselves real. Thoughts are misty. Words are solid. When you say a thing out loud, you build a small piece of scaffolding around it, and the scaffolding lets you climb higher next time. After tea, I began very slowly to tell others. Not everyone, not publicly, but a few carefully chosen people, in carefully chosen moments, in ways that respected both my truth and their capacity to receive it. Telling my family was the hardest part, and I want to speak about it carefully because I know that family is complicated for everyone and that no two families respond to a disclosure the same way. My family did not respond perfectly. They also did not respond terribly. They responded like people who loved me and who had never been given any preparation for a conversation like the one I was inviting them into. My mother cried, though not, I think, out of anger. She cried the way people cry when they realize they have not fully known someone they thought they fully knew. My father was quiet for a long time. He asked practical questions, some of which I could answer, and some of which I couldn't. My sister, who by then was an adult with her own life, was the quickest to reach out with warmth, though she also admitted that she would need time to understand. There were hard weeks after that. There were phone calls that ended too early. There were silences that felt heavier than they had before. But there were also small moments of grace. My mother, a few months in, sent me a package with a scarf she thought I might like. She didn't say anything about it in her note. She just wrote, "I saw this and thought of you." I understood exactly what she meant. My father, about a year later, asked me a question during a walk that showed he had been reading quietly on his own. My sister introduced me, gradually, to her friends in a way that respected who I was becoming. None of them became perfect allies overnight. Perfection was not the point. The point was that they stayed and they tried and they learned, and I stayed and I tried and I learned too. Family, when it works, is a mutual apprenticeship in patience. Around this time, I also began to think more seriously about my mental health, and I want to speak about this openly because I think there is still too much silence around the mental health dimensions of identity exploration. For years, I had carried the fog and the quiet largely alone, and while I had developed a kind of resilience, I had also accumulated a certain amount of wear. I had periods of low mood that lasted longer than they should have. I had anxieties that spun in tight, unproductive circles. I had, at times, a difficulty imagining a future for myself, not because I was in immediate danger, but because the shape of the future was so uncertain that my mind sometimes refused to picture it at all. I sought help. I found a therapist who specialized in identity and who had the rare and precious gift of listening without steering. I did not go to her for answers. I went to her for a space in which I could ask my own questions out loud. Over the months and years I worked with her, I learned things about myself that I could not have learned alone. I learned that some of the fog was not about identity at all, but about long-standing habits of self-criticism that had accumulated during the years I spent hiding. I learned that some of the quiet was grief. Grief for the child who had not had the words, grief for the teenager who had felt alone, grief for the young adult who had spent so much energy performing. I learned that grief, properly honored, becomes something you can carry rather than something that carries you. I learned that self-acceptance is not a single act but a daily practice, closer to gardening than to construction. I also learned, and this is one of the most important things I have learned in my life, that identity exploration is not the same thing as identity resolution, and that both are legitimate. There are people for whom exploration leads to a clear, stable destination, a new name, a new pronoun, a new life. There are people for whom exploration leads to a quieter reintegration, a broader sense of self that does not require external change. There are people for whom the exploration itself is the point, an ongoing conversation with oneself that never fully resolves, and that does not need to. All of these paths are valid. None of them is more real than the others. The mistake, I think, is to assume that everyone must arrive at the same destination, or that having a destination is the only proof of having taken the journey seriously. For myself, over time, I arrived at a way of living that felt honest, without being performative. I do not want to be more specific than that, because I have come to believe that the specifics of any one person's path are less useful to others than the underlying principles. What I can say is that I now move through the world in a way that reflects, as truthfully as I can manage, who I actually am. I have accepted that some days I will feel more certain than others. I have accepted that some people in my life will understand me more easily than others. I have accepted that my own understanding of myself will continue to evolve, and that this evolution is not a failure of earlier certainty, but a sign of continued attention. There are lessons I would like to share, not as prescriptions but as offerings, in case any of them are useful to someone listening. The first lesson is that patience with yourself is not the same as passivity. You can be gentle with your own uncertainty while still moving, slowly and honestly, toward greater self-knowledge. The second lesson is that secrecy has costs, but so does premature disclosure, and part of wisdom is learning to tell the difference between a truth that needs air and a truth that needs a little more time in the dark. The third lesson is that the people who love you are usually more capable of expanding to include the truth of you than you fear they are, but they also usually need time, and giving them time is not a betrayal of your truth. It is a kindness that increases the chance the relationship will survive. The fourth lesson, and one I hold especially close, is that identity is not the same as identity crisis. For most of my early life, I experienced my identity as a crisis because I had been taught, implicitly, that any deviation from expected norms was a problem to be solved. When I stopped treating my identity as a crisis and started treating it as a fact about me to be understood, the entire emotional temperature of my life changed. The questions did not go away, but the panic around the questions did. I recommend this shift, if you can find your way to it, to anyone who is exploring anything about themselves. Move from crisis to curiosity. Curiosity is a kinder companion. The fifth lesson is about responsibility. I have come to believe that self-acceptance and moral responsibility are not opposites but partners. Learning to accept myself did not make me less accountable to the people in my life. It made me more accountable because I could no longer hide behind the excuse of not knowing who I was. I had to show up honestly in my relationships. I had to communicate more clearly. I had to take responsibility for my impact on others. Self-acceptance, done well, does not turn you inward and away from the world. It equips you to turn outward and toward it with a steadier sense of what you have to offer. The sixth lesson is about empathy, and it is the lesson I want to end on. When I was younger, I sometimes imagined that once I understood myself, I would finally be able to explain myself to others and that the explanation would resolve everything. I have since learned that explanation is only a small part of what people need from each other. What they need, most of the time, is empathy, which does not require full understanding. Empathy is the willingness to sit with someone in their reality, even when you cannot fully share it. It is what T offered me when I told him. It is what my mother slowly learned to offer me. It is what my therapist offered me from the first session. And it is what I try, imperfectly, to offer others, especially to those whose paths are different from mine. If my story has any single practical use, I hope it is this. Whatever you learn about yourself, use it to become more empathetic, not more certain. Certainty is a small room. Empathy is a whole country. I want to say something, too, about the small, ordinary joys that I did not expect. When you spend a long time in the fog, you sometimes imagine that the sunlight, if it ever comes, will be dramatic, a burst, a revelation, a scene from a film. In my experience, the sunlight was quieter than that. It came in small forms. It came in the moment I bought a coat that I loved and wore it out of the shop without a knot in my stomach. It came in the moment a stranger held a door open for me without a second thought. It came in the moment I laughed at a joke and heard my own laugh and thought, that is my laugh, that is how I laugh now, and it sounded like mine in a way it hadn't before. It came in the moment my sister sent me a photograph of her child, my niece, and I looked at the small face and felt the specific tenderness of being an aunt or an uncle or whatever word my niece will eventually choose for me, and I understood that I would be loved by this new person from the beginning, without any of the retrofitting the older adults in my life had had to do. It came in the moment I realized I had not thought about the fog in a week because I had been too busy living. I want to speak, near the end of this, about something that might sound like a small point but that I consider central. Throughout this whole story, I have never wanted to be anyone other than myself. That may sound obvious, but it is not. For many years, I confused wanting to be myself with wanting to be someone else because I had been taught that myself was a fixed, predetermined thing and that anything outside the thing was foreign. When I finally understood that myself was not a boundary I was trying to escape, but a territory I was trying to map, the entire project of my life changed. I was not running away from the boy in the mirror when I was 11. I was running toward a more complete picture of the person that boy would grow into. The dress I held against my chest that afternoon was not a rejection of who I was. It was an early, wordless recognition of who I already was becoming. Recognition, in the end, is a gentler word than transformation, and I think it is often the more accurate one. If you are listening to this, and you are somewhere on your own version of this road, whatever your particular questions are, I want to offer you a few plain hopes. I hope you find at least one person you can tell. I hope you find at least one book or one voice or one story that makes you feel less alone. I hope you find the patience to move at your own pace rather than at a pace imposed on you by anyone else, including yourself. I hope you find a way to be honest with the people who love you, and I hope they meet your honesty with the effort it deserves. I hope you learn to distinguish between the discomfort of growth and the discomfort of denial because they feel similar at first, but they lead to very different places. I hope you take care of your mental health as seriously as you take care of your identity, because the two are woven together and neither thrives when the other is neglected. I hope, when you look in the mirror, you begin to see not a problem to solve but a person to know. And if you are listening to this and you are not on this particular road yourself but you love someone who is, I want to offer you a few hopes as well. I hope you resist the urge to have all the right words immediately. I hope you allow yourself to be a learner rather than an expert. I hope you understand that your patience, your presence, and your willingness to stay in the conversation are worth more than any perfectly phrased response. I hope you extend to the person you love the same grace you would want extended to you if the roles were reversed. I hope you remember that they have almost certainly been thinking about this for far longer than you have, and that their apparent calm, if they are calm, is the product of years of quiet work you did not see. I hope you do not treat their disclosure as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be received, even if it is a gift that requires you to grow in order to hold it. I have thought many times about the pale blue dress with the tiny white flowers. I have thought about the small child in the hallway with the yellow light, holding the dress against his chest, seeing something in the mirror he did not have the words for.
I do not romanticize that child.
I do not pity him either. I feel toward him something closer to gratitude. He was doing the best he could with what he had, which was nothing but instinct and courage he did not know he possessed. He kept the truth alive, even when he had to keep it hidden, and he passed it forward year after year to the older versions of himself that would eventually be ready to receive it. If there is one thing I would say to that child, if I could, it would not be a promise that everything would be easy. It would be a simple assurance. You are not making it up, and you are not alone. And someday, in a way you cannot yet imagine, you will meet the person in the mirror, and you'll get to know her, and she will be worth knowing. I have told the story as honestly as I know how. I have left out details that belong to other people because their stories are not mine to tell. I have simplified some things because the full complexity would fill many more hours than this. I have tried, above all, to speak in a way that might be useful to someone else. Not because my life is exemplary. It isn't. It is ordinary in most respects, in the ways that most lives are ordinary. But I have come to believe that ordinary lives, told carefully, are one of the most valuable things human beings can offer each other. Not because they answer every question, but because they demonstrate that questions can be lived with, and lived through, and lived past. There are still days when the fog returns, in small forms. There are still moments when the old questions rise up and knock politely on the door. But I have learned to open the door and offer them a seat and a cup of tea, rather than pretending I am not home. They are, after all, old companions. They have walked with me a long way. I no longer need to be afraid of them. I no longer need to hide from them. I can sit with them and listen to what they have to say, and, when they are done, watch them leave on their own, without having taken anything from me that I was not willing to give. If there is a final image I would like to leave you with, it is this: a small kitchen table in a small apartment on an ordinary evening. There is a cup of tea. There is a book. There is a soft lamp. There is a person, sitting quietly, who has spent many years becoming acquainted with herself, and who has arrived, not at a triumphant destination, but at a livable peace. She is not finished. She does not need to be finished. She is simply here, at home in her own life, in a way she once could not have imagined. And that, I have come to believe, is the real ending of any good identity story. Not spectacle, not revelation, just the quiet, ongoing, dignified fact of being present in one's own life. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.